The first thing Kaelen Voss noticed was not the pain. Pain was an old friend, a heavy coat he had worn since the day they wired his spine into the station's mainframe. No, the first thing he noticed was the smell of scorched ozone and the sterile, clinical scent of recycled oxygen that tasted like copper on his tongue. He tried to draw a breath, but his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. His vision was a fractured mosaic of white light and shifting shadows. Static hissed in his ears, a jagged rhythm that synchronized with the erratic pulsing of his synapse bridge. On his internal display, a dozen red icons flickered like dying embers. Critical failure. Biointegrity at 15%. Ether plating depleted. He tried to move his right arm, but the feedback was a scream of raw electricity. Deep breaths, Voss, he told himself, though his chest barely moved. Focus on the hard points. He remembered the screaming, not his, he never screamed, but Lysandra's. He remembered the ion lances cutting through the twilight of the crystal gallery, the way the stealth drones had materialized out of the shadows like ghosts made of chrome. He remembered stepping forward, a wall of meat and circuitry, taking hit after hit until his vision turned red. 112 direct impacts. He had counted them until the 100th. Then the numbers had blurred into a singular, agonizing vibration. A voice cut through the fog. It was low, resonant, and carried a weight that no machine could replicate. "Stay with us, Commander. That is a direct order." Kaelen blinked. The white light resolved into the vaulted ceiling of the Royal Infirmary. He was suspended in a gravity cradle, his body partially submerged in a thick, translucent restoration gel. To his left, a swarm of soma weavers hummed as they knitted his shattered ribs back together with filaments of carbon fiber. He turned his head. It felt like moving a mountain. Archon Valerius sat in a hard-backed chair less than 3 meters away. She was not wearing her ceremonial robes. Her shoulders were draped in a simple military cloak, and her long, pointed ears were bare of the obsidian rings that signified her absolute authority over Xylos Station. She looked older than she had that morning. There were shadows beneath her eyes that no filter could hide. "Your Majesty," Kaelen croaked. The words felt like they were being dragged over sandpaper. "You are out of position." "The council is in session, yes," Valerius replied, her voice steady despite the visible exhaustion. "General Cross is currently arguing that I should be presiding over the security tribunal instead of watching a remnant bleed out in a medbay." Kaelen managed a ghost of a smirk. "The general is a tactical pragmatist. He is right. I am a replaceable asset." "You are a fool," the Archon said quietly. She stood up, the floor plates of the infirmary humming beneath her boots. She approached the edge of the gravity cradle, her gaze sweeping over the network of tubes and bypass valves keeping him tethered to the living. "You took over 100 ion bolts to ensure my daughter reached the blast shelter without a single scratch. On Xylos, we do not discard the shield that held the line." "Policy dictates," Kaelen began, but a sharp spike of neural feedback silenced him. "Policy is for those who lack the courage to lead," Valerius countered. She placed a hand on the transparent rim of the cradle. "They want me to leave. They say the optics are bad. A ruler keeping vigil for a soldier? It smells of weakness to them. But I told them that the Aegis is not built of steel, Voss. It is built of this." She gestured to his mangled chest, where the soma weavers were struggling to bridge a massive gap in his sternum. "Lysandra?" he asked, his voice fading. "Safe. Locked in the inner sanctum. She has been trying to bypass the medical locks for 4 hours to see you. I had to threaten her with house arrest." Kaelen felt a faint warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the healing gel. "Stubborn kid." "She learned it from her bodyguard," Valerius said. The alarms on the monitors shifted frequency. A medic drone descended from the ceiling, its optical sensors glowing a soft, warning yellow. "Neural cascade imminent," the machine announced in its flat, synthetic tone. "The patient requires deep cycle sedation for synapse integration." Valerius did not move. She looked down at Kaelen, her expression unreadable, a mask of iron that had protected Xylos for 23 years. But as the sedation began to flow into his veins, Kaelen saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the cradle until her knuckles turned white. "Do not slip away, Kaelen," she whispered as the darkness rushed in to claim him. I have not authorized your departure. He wanted to tell her that death didn't care much for authorizations, but the blackout was total. He fell into the void, the smell of ozone replaced by the cold, silent memory of the stars. 6 hours before the world broke, Xylos Station was a masterpiece of artificial tranquility. Kaelen Voss stood on the terrace of the Bastion 7, his boots locked into the magnetic floor grid. Above him, the pulsar pulsed with a rhythmic, violet light, filtered through 3 layers of atmospheric shielding. To a civilian, it was a beautiful sight. To Kaelen, it was a constant reminder that only 6 centimeters of reinforced hull stood between the population and a cosmic incinerator. "You're doing that thing again," Lysandra said. She was sitting on the railing, her legs dangling over a 300-meter drop into the industrial sector. Kaelen didn't turn his head. His ocular implants were busy scanning the flight paths of 24 freight shuttles. "What thing, Highness?" "The calculating the probability of our imminent demise look. It makes your eyebrows do a weird twitchy thing." "I am a remnant," Kaelen replied, his voice a low rumble. "My eyebrows are calibrated for maximum vigilance. And please, step back from the edge. My insurance doesn't cover gravity-induced stupidity." Lysandra laughed, a bright, clear sound that felt out of place in a fortress built of obsidian and paranoia. At 17, she was a whirlwind of energy that the Archon's protocols couldn't quite contain. She wore a flight suit instead of silk, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot that would have made the royal stylist faint. "You're so grim, Voss. We're in the most secure sector of the most secure station in the sector. What's going to happen? Is the pulsar going to sneeze?" "Complacency is the first stage of a flat line," Kaelen muttered. He checked his internal chronometer. 1,400 hours. Shift rotation for the exterior sentries. A 5-second window where the sensor grid recalibrated. "And for the record, I'm not grim. I'm focused." "You're a bored soldier looking for a ghost," she teased, hopping down from the railing. She walked over to him, her head barely reaching his shoulder. "One day I'm going to redesign this whole place. No more gray walls, no more security checkpoints every 10 meters. We'll have windows that actually let in real light." "Windows are structural vulnerabilities," Kaelen said, repeating the mantra he'd had drilled into his skull since the academy. "Windows are how you know what you're fighting for," she countered. She looked up at him, her eyes softening. "Do you ever think about it? Life after the contract? When they unhook you from the Aegis and let you go to the surface of a real planet?" Kaelen went still. It was a forbidden thought. Remnants didn't dream of retirement. They dreamed of a clean death that didn't compromise the mission. "I am a tool of the Archon, Lysandra. Tools don't have travel plans." "You're not a tool. You're Kaelen. You like synth coffee that's too bitter to drink, and you spend your off hours reading ancient tactical manuals because you think they're relaxing. You're a person, even if you've got more wires in you than a cargo drone." Kaelen felt a strange tightness in his synapse bridge. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and for a second, the cold logic of his programming faltered. He saw the girl who had once hidden spiders in his helmet when she was 6. He saw the future ruler of Xylos, a girl who still believed that the universe could be kind. "Time to move," he said, his voice a bit rougher than intended. "The Archon expects you in the war room for the provincial briefings." "Ugh, more talk about trade routes and oxygen taxes. Can't we just say I have a headache?" "You had a headache yesterday, and the day before. Your medical record is starting to look like a work of fiction. Let's go." They moved through the corridors of the Citadel, a grand architecture of black stone and shimmering holograms. Guards snapped to attention as they passed, their armor clanking in a synchronized rhythm. Kaelen kept his hand near his sidearm, his eyes never stopping. He checked the heat signatures in the service ducts. He cross-referenced the ID tags of every technician they passed. "Zero dark 30, he whispered into his comms link, checking in with the central hub. "All solid, Voss," came the reply. "Sector 7 is clear. Enjoy the briefing." They reached the Crystal Gallery, a vast promenade with a transparent floor that looked down into the core of the station. It was the pride of Xylos, a display of wealth and technological dominance. Kaelen stopped. His ocular implant flickered. A micro-fluctuation in the light refraction near the ornamental pillars. It was nothing. A shadow. A glitch in the sensors. "Voss, what is it?" Lysandra asked, sensing the sudden change in his posture. Get behind me, Kaelen said, his voice dropping into a combat register. Voss, you're being paranoid. Now! He didn't wait for her to move. He grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the reinforced doorway of the transit lift. At the same moment, the air 5 meters in front of them shimmered. 3 stealth drones, sleek and angular like predatory insects, decloaked with a high-pitched whine. Static! Kaelen yelled into his comms, but the channel was flooded with white noise. We have hostiles in the gallery. Blackout protocol. The first drone fired. A bolt of concentrated ion energy streaked through the air. Kaelen stepped into its path, his ether plating flaring a brilliant blue as it absorbed the impact. The force of it knocked the wind out of him, but he didn't move. Run, Lysandra. Key the emergency override. He drew his pulse pistol and returned fire, blowing the sensor array off the lead drone. But more were appearing. 10, 20, 50. A swarm. They weren't just here to kidnap. They were here to erase. The gallery turned into a furnace of light and screaming metal. Kaelen was a whirlwind of motion, positioning himself as a physical barrier between the princess and the storm. He felt the armor plates on his chest buckle. He felt the searing heat of the ion lances biting through his skin. 1 hit, 10 hits, 50. His vision began to fringe with red. His synapse bridge was screaming warnings of systemic overload. But through the haze of pain and static, he saw the elevator doors closing. He saw Lysandra's face, pale and terrified, as she disappeared into the safety of the reinforced shaft. He was alone now. All right, you scrap heaps, Kaelen wheezed, his blood dripping onto the transparent floor. Let's see how much it takes to break a remnant. He dropped his empty pistol and drew his combat blade, the monofilament edge glowing with a lethal hum. He didn't retreat. He advanced, stepping into the fire, a man who had finally found his choice in the heart of a dying world. The lift doors hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. Kaelen Voss caught a glimpse of Lysandra's widening eyes, the pale terror reflecting the blue strobe of his failing shields, before the reinforced obsidian alloy sealed her away. She was safe. The transit lift was a self-contained kinetic shell designed to withstand a direct hit from an orbital strike. Unless the intruders had the override codes for the Royal Sanctum, she was beyond their reach, which meant they only had one target left. Kaelen stood in the center of the crystal gallery, his breathing a ragged, wet whistle. His internal HUD was a graveyard of red status icons. The synapse bridge at the base of his skull hummed with a frantic, buzzing heat, trying to route power to his shattered limbs. His ether plating was gone, stripped away in jagged flakes of composite metal, leaving the raw, silver circuitry of his undersuit exposed. He was a mess, a walking casualty, a piece of state-owned hardware that should have been decommissioned 10 minutes ago. The stealth drones, void shards as the military called them, didn't move with the clunky logic of standard security bots. They drifted through the air like predatory fish, their hulls absorbing the violet light of the pulsar outside. They didn't speak. They didn't demand surrender. They simply recalibrated. Static, Kaelen muttered, spitting a glob of metallic-tasting blood onto the transparent floor. I'm starting to think you guys don't like me. The lead drone, a jagged diamond of black chrome, tilted its sensor array. A low-frequency whine began to build in the air, the sound of an ion lance charging. Kaelen didn't wait for the discharge. He kicked off the magnetic floor grid, his boots sparking as they disengaged. He moved with a speed that ignored the structural damage to his femur and ribs. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a series of kinetic equations dictated by a failing processor. He swung his monofilament blade in a wide, shimmering arc, catching the first drone across its optical housing. The blade hummed as it sliced through the stealth matrix, sending a spray of blue sparks and cooling fluid across the promenade. The drone didn't explode. It simply tumbled, its gravity drive whining in protest, before Kaelen crushed its core with the heel of his boot. That's one, he grunted. The remaining 49 drones didn't hesitate. They opened fire in unison. The crystal gallery erupted into a storm of ionized plasma. The air itself seemed to catch fire, a blinding blizzard of white-hot bolts that turned the refined aesthetics of the promenade into a slaughterhouse. Kaelen ducked behind a massive ornamental pillar made of imported marble glass. the stone shattering instantly under the barrage. His suit's AI began a frantic tally. Impact 64. Shield integrity 0%. Impact 65. External plating compromised. Impact 66. Neural feedback at 85%. Kaelen leaned his head back against the vibrating pillar, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. The pain was no longer a sensation. It was a geography. He could map every burn, every shrapnel entry, every fractured bone as if they were coordinates on a tactical map. Kaelen, a voice whispered in the back of his mind. Not the AI, but a memory. It was the Archon, years ago, during his final integration. You are the last line. When the walls fall, you are the wall. I'm trying, Your Majesty, he thought, a grim smile tugging at his cracked lips. But the wall is starting to get some serious cracks. He lunged from behind the pillar, moving in a low, jagged serpentine. He was too large to be graceful, but he was too fast to be easily tracked. He was a blur of silver and shadow, weaving through the lattice of ion bolts. He threw a thermal grenade at the ceiling, the blast scattering the drones and creating a momentary screen of smoke and debris. He used that second to close the distance. He grabbed a drone by its weapon port, tearing the limb out of its socket with a scream of stressed metal, then swung the machine like a flail into two of its companions. The feedback from his synapse bridge was a physical weight now. It felt like someone was driving a red-hot needle into the base of his brain. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the room turning into a smear of gray. 82 impacts, 94 impacts. He was losing blood. The restoration nanites in his suit were working at maximum saturation, weaving through his flesh to seal the arteries, but they were running out of raw materials. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape a collapsing cage. Stay upright, Voss, he snarled at himself. You don't get to go dark yet. A bolt caught him square in the chest, the kinetic force throwing him backward. He hit the railing of the promenade, the obsidian alloy groaning under the impact. Below him, the industrial heart of Xylos spun in a slow, mechanical dance. 1,000 levels of steel and life that he had sworn to protect. He looked up. The drones were hovering in a semicircle, their weapons glowing with a final, lethal charge. They had stopped moving. They were waiting for the final execution order. Kaelen tried to lift his blade, but his arm refused to obey. The neural link was frayed, the signals lost in a sea of interference. He slumped against the railing, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He watched the drones. He saw the way their hulls reflected the violet pulsar light. And in that moment, he saw the markings on their undercarriages. It wasn't the emblem of an external invader. It wasn't the jagged sigil of the Nebula Raiders. It was the stylized raven of House Valor. Internal, he realized, the thought cold and sharp. This wasn't a raid. It was a coup. The drones fired. Kaelen didn't close his eyes. He watched the white light rush toward him, 100 teeth of plasma aiming for his core. He thought of Lysandra, safe behind the vault doors. He thought of the Archon, sitting in her war room, unaware that the Vipers were already in the nest. He felt the first bolt hit, then the second. Then the world became a singular, blinding scream of energy. He took the 100th hit, then the 110th. He didn't fall. He couldn't. His magnetic boots were still locked to the floor, his body held upright by the very technology that was failing him. He stood there, a scorched and broken monument to a duty he had never questioned until the drones finally ran out of power and the gallery fell into a terrifying ozone-scented silence. Kaelen Voss stood in the center of the ruin for 5 long seconds. Then slowly, like a mountain being reclaimed by the earth, he collapsed. The last thing he felt was the vibration of the floor plates as the transit lift opened. The last thing he heard was a scream, not of terror, but of a grief so profound it cut through the static in his brain like a blade. And then, for the first time in 12 years, the remnant went dark. The Royal Infirmary was not a place for silence. It was a cathedral of noise, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, the high-pitched whine of surgical lasers, and the frantic, staccato barking of orders from the head medics. But today, the noise was different. It carried an edge of panic that the staff of Xylos Station had never experienced. Archon Valerius stood in the observation gallery above Surgical Suite 1, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She had not moved in 3 hours. She had watched as they cut the charred remains of the ether plating from Kaelen's body. She had watched as they pulled 42 fragments of shrapnel from his lungs. She had watched as the soma weavers ran out of carbon fiber and had to switch to synthetic bone grafting. "Your Majesty," a voice said from the doorway. Valerius did not turn. She knew the voice. It was General Cross, the commander of the station's security forces, and a man who viewed the world as a series of tactical assets to be spent or saved. "The council is growing restless, Valerius," Cross said, stepping into the room. He smelled of gun smoke and recycled air. He had spent the last few hours purging the lower levels of the remaining Valor loyalists. The ambush in the gallery was more than a failure of security. It was a decapitation strike. "We need you in the chamber. We need a declaration of martial law." "The declaration is already signed, General," Valerius replied, her voice cold and thin as a wire. "I sent it to your terminal 20 minutes ago. My presence in the chamber will not make the purging of House Valor any faster." Cross walked to the railing and looked down into the surgical pit. He grunted, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Kaelen's mangled form, suspended in a web of life support lines. "He's a ghost, Valerius," Cross said bluntly. "No human, not even a remnant with a synapse bridge, survives 100+ direct ion hits. His internal organs are more slag than tissue. You're wasting royal resources on a dead man." "He is breathing," she said. "He is breathing because you've authorized the use of the bloodline tier nanite reserves," Cross countered, his voice rising. "Those reserves are meant for you, for Lysandra, for the survival of the Archon's line. You are spending the station's insurance policy on a bodyguard who was simply doing what he was programmed to do." Valerius finally turned. The look in her eyes made the general take a half step back. It wasn't the look of a ruler, it was the look of a predator protecting its own. "He was not programmed to do what he did, Cross," she said softly. "The mission parameters for a remnant prioritize self-preservation if the primary target is deemed secure. Once Lysandra was in that lift, Kaelen's protocols told him to retreat, to find cover, to save the hardware." She gestured toward the man in the pit. "He stayed. He stood in the center of that gallery, and he took every single bolt meant for the lift's tracking array. He didn't do that because of a line of code. He did it because he chose to. And on Xylos, I will not have it said that we value the code more than the soul." Cross exhaled, a sharp, frustrated sound. "The council doesn't care about his soul, Valerius. They care about the memory core. The synapse bridge in his spine contains the encryption keys for the Aegis's outer defense grid. If he dies and the core destabilizes, we lose the ability to reset the station's shields. We become a sitting duck for any Valor remnant fleet still lurking in the nebula." "Then pray he lives, General," she said, turning back to the glass. Down in the pit, the chief medic looked up at the gallery, his face mask splattered with green-tinged synthetic blood. "Your Majesty, we've hit a wall. The neural interface is spiking. The synapse bridge is rejecting the graft." Valerius moved to the intercom. "What do you need, Doctor?" "The bridge is trying to reconnect to the station's mainframe, but the damage to his primary cortex is too severe," the medic shouted over the roar of a cooling fan. "If we don't stabilize the signal flow, the core will melt down. We'll lose him, and we'll lose the keys." "Extract the core," Cross barked from beside the Archon. "Save the keys, Valerius. It's the only logical move." "If you extract the core now, what happens to the patient?" Valerius asked, her eyes fixed on the monitor showing Kaelen's heart rate. The medic hesitated. "The bridge is integrated into his motor cortex, Highness. If we pull it while he's in this state, his brain will flatline. He won't survive the disconnect." "Do it," Cross said. "One life for the security of 10 million citizens. It's the math of command." Valerius stared at Kaelen. She remembered him as a boy, before the wires and the plating. She remembered the way he used to look at the stars with a hunger that the station could never satisfy. She remembered the day she had signed the order to turn him into a remnant, a decision that had haunted her for over a decade. "No," she said. "Valerius," Cross snapped. "This is not a time for sentiment." "It is not sentiment, Cross. It is a calculation," she replied, her voice regaining its iron authority. "If we pull that core, We admit that the only thing of value in this station is the machinery. We admit that House Vaylor was right, that we are all just parts in a system. I will not rule a station of parts." She pressed the intercom again. "Doctor, prepare the royal biocircuit." The room went silent. Even the drones seemed to pause in their humming. "Your Majesty," the medic said, his voice trembling, "the biocircuit it's tuned to your DNA, to the bloodline. Integrating it into a human, into a remnant, is unprecedented. The rejection rate could be catastrophic for both of you if we have to link the biosignatures." "I am not asking for a lecture on probability, Doctor," Valeria said. "I am giving an order. Integrate the circuit. Stabilize the bridge. Save my commander." Cross looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "You're going to link yourself to him? If he dies during the integration, the neural shock could put you in a coma. You're risking the throne for a gearhead." "He's not a gearhead, General," Valeria said, her gaze never wavering from the man in the pit. "He's the only person in this station who didn't ask for a price before he bled for it. That makes him more royal than anyone in your council." The surgery began. It was a delicate, terrifying dance of biology and light. The royal biocircuit, a delicate lattice of gold and glowing blue fibers, was brought into the room in a pressurized containment field. It was the heart of Xylos, a piece of technology so advanced it was indistinguishable from magic, designed to allow the Archon to commune directly with the station's sentient systems. The medics worked with a frantic, sweating precision. They opened the base of Kaelen's skull, exposing the silver and red ruin of his neural bridge. The air in the suite grew thick with the smell of scorched ozone once again, as the biocircuit was introduced to the interface. On the monitors, the two signals, one a jagged, dying red, the other a steady regal blue, began to overlap. The rejection was immediate. Kaelen's body bucked against the gravity cradle, his muscles spasming with enough force to snap the carbon fiber filaments. The alarm screamed a discordant, terrifying chorus. "He's ghosting!" the medic yelled. "We're losing the sync!" Valerius closed her eyes. She reached out with her mind, tapping into the dormant link she shared with the biocircuit. It was a cold, vast sensation, like stepping into a frozen ocean. She searched for the flicker of red in the darkness, the stubborn, defiant spark that was Kaelen Voss. She found it, buried under a mountain of pain and static. "Stay," she whispered into the neural void. "That is a direct order, Commander." For a long, agonizing minute, the red signal flickered on the edge of extinction. Cross watched the monitors with a grim, expectant silence. The medics held their breath, their hands hovering over the emergency stop controls. And then, the blue began to wrap around the red. It didn't consume it, it supported it. The jagged lines on the monitor began to smooth out, the two colors weaving together into a stable, pulsing violet. "Sync achieved," the medic whispered, his voice cracking with relief. "Integration at 80%. Vitals are stabilizing." Valerius exhaled, a long, shaky breath that she had been holding for what felt like an eternity. She slumped slightly against the railing, the weight of the neural link pressing against her temples like a physical bruise. "He's alive," she murmured. Cross looked at the monitors, then at the Archon. He didn't look happy, but he looked silenced. He gave a sharp, stiff nod and turned toward the door. "He's alive for now," Cross said. "But the Council still wants those keys, Valerius. And House Vaylor isn't finished. You've saved the man, but you might have just lost us the station." The general marched out, his heavy boots echoing in the corridor. Valerius didn't watch him go. She looked back down at Kaelen. He was still submerged in the gel, still covered in the marks of a battle he should have lost. But as she watched, his hand, the one that had held the blade against 49 drones, gave a small, deliberate twitch. The Soma Weavers continued their work, their hum a soft lullaby in the quiet of the room. The Archon pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and sat down in the hardback chair. She didn't have her rings. She didn't have her council. She only had a broken soldier and a pulsing violet light on a screen. And for the first time in 23 years, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The hours stretched into the fourth day of the vigil. The infirmary had settled into a rhythmic, artificial dusk. Most of the staff had been rotated out, leaving only a skeleton crew of drones and the chief medic. Lysandra had finally been allowed into the room. She sat on the floor near the base of the gravity cradle, her back against the cool metal, a small tablet in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was watching the way the restoration gel moved in slow, viscous ripples around Kaelen's chest. "Is he going to be different, Mother?" she asked quietly. Valerius, who had been reviewing tactical reports on a holographic display, looked down at her daughter. "Different how?" "The biocircuit," Lysandra said, gesturing to the glowing lattice at the base of Kaelen's neck. "It's part of us. It's part of the station. He's connected to everything now, isn't he?" "He is connected to the Aegis," Valerius corrected. "It will make him faster, more resilient. It will allow him to see the station systems as if they were his own limbs." "But will he still be him?" Lysandra persisted, her voice small. "Will he still hate the coffee? Will he still remember the spiders?" Valerius went still. She thought about the cold, vast ocean of the neural link. She thought about the way Kaelen's spark had resisted the integration until she had offered him a reason to stay. "He will still be Kaelen," Valerius said, her voice softening, "but he will carry a heavier weight now. We all will." Lysandra looked back at the man in the cradle. "I told him I'd redesign the station. I told him we'd have real windows." "Maybe you should," Valerius said. "Why?" "Because he's spent his whole life being a wall, Lysandra. Maybe it's time we showed him what he's been protecting." The girl nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She reached out and placed a hand on the glass of the cradle, right over the spot where Kaelen's heart was beating in a steady, violet rhythm. Outside, the pulsar blinked in the dark, a silent witness to a station that was no longer just a fortress of obsidian, but a place where a choice had been made to keep a soul from drifting into the void. The war with House Valor was coming. They all felt it in the vibration of the deck plates. But for this moment, in this room, the only thing that mattered was the breath of a single man. 24,000 seconds of silence followed, and in every one of them, the Archon did not leave his side. The void was not empty. This was the first truth Kaelen Voss learned when his consciousness drifted away from the white-hot agony of the Royal Infirmary and into the cold, silent architecture of the Synapse Bridge. To the medics on the outside, he was a body in a gravity cradle, a collection of failing organs and flickering neural pathways. But inside the interface, Kaelen was a ghost walking through a cathedral of light and data. The space was an infinite expanse of dark glass, crisscrossed by glowing filaments of violet and gold. The violet was his own mind, the jagged, battle-scarred remains of his military-grade implants. The gold was the royal biocircuit, the alien, elegant technology of Archon Valerius that was currently stitching his soul back together. It feels like drowning in a sun, Kaelen thought. He had no body here, only a sense of presence, a flickering point of awareness in a sea of information. He began to walk, or at least he imagined the sensation of movement. Every step he took sent ripples through the data stream. He saw fragments of his own life floating past him, like shards of a broken mirror. He saw himself at 7 years old, standing in the rain on a colony world whose name had been erased from his files. He saw the cold, sterile room where they had first inserted the neural needles into his spine. He saw the faces of the 34 men and women who had died in the same program, their minds unable to handle the weight of the Aegis. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus, 1,000 whispers layered on top of one another, echoing through the glass hallways of his mind. Kaelen stopped. The golden filaments around him began to coalesce, forming shapes that looked like people, but lacked faces. They were translucent, shimmering with the steady pulse of the station's heart. "Who are you?" Kaelen asked. His voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded like the vibration of a tuning fork. "We are the remnants," the chorus replied. "We are the ones who came before. The ones who became the wall so Xylos could breathe." Kaelen looked at them. He realized he was looking at the archived consciousness of every bodyguard, every sentry, and every protector who had ever been linked to the Synapse Bridge. They were not dead, not exactly. They were stored data, ghosts in the machine, preserved to maintain the station's encryption keys. "I'm not ready to join the archive," Kaelen said, his violet light flaring with a sudden, defiant heat. "I have a job to do." "A job?" One of the figures stepped forward. Its form was more distinct than the others, glowing with a faint, ancient silver. Your job is finished, Voss. You took the hits. You fulfilled the contract. Look at your code. You are broken beyond repair. If you return to the world of flesh, you will only know pain. You will be a prisoner in a cage of scars. The Archon told me to stay, Kaelen countered. The chorus laughed, a sound like falling ice. The Archon sees a tool that still has a few uses left. She sees the memory core in your spine. She doesn't see the man. Why return to a life of servitude when you can find peace here, in the eternal logic of the station? Kaelen hesitated. The temptation was a physical weight. Here there was no pain. There was no smell of ozone, no taste of blood, no terrifying responsibility of standing between a princess and a storm. He could simply let go. He could fade into the gold and become part of the legend. But then, a new sensation rippled through the void. It was a touch, faint, distant, but undeniably real. It was the feeling of a hand on his forearm. It wasn't the cold, calculated grip of a medic or the sharp directive of a superior officer. It was something else. It was warm. It was grounding. He heard her voice, muffled as if through miles of deep water. You are not permitted to die. Devotion chosen freely is stronger than obedience commanded. Kaelen looked at his hands, or the projections of them. They were flickering, shifting between the silver of the remnants and the raw, jagged red of his own suffering. She's still there, he whispered. She is a ruler, the silver figure said. She is staying because the optics demand it, because the council is watching. No, Kaelen said, and as he spoke, the violet light within him began to burn brighter, cutting through the golden fog of the royal biocircuit. She's staying because she's exhausted. I can feel it through the link. She's tired of being the Archon. She's just a person, sitting in a hard chair, waiting for a friend to wake up. The chorus of ghosts drifted back, their shimmering forms agitated. You are choosing agony, Voss. You are choosing to be a variable in a world that wants you to be a constant. I am a variable, Kaelen snarled, the words echoing with the power of the station's entire defense grid. That's what she said, and a variable gets to choose where it lands. He reached out and grabbed the golden filaments of the royal biocircuit. He didn't let them weave through him anymore. He took control of them. He pulled the energy into his core, forced the alien technology to submit to his will. The pain returned instantly, a blinding, screaming tide of sensory input as his mind reconnected with his broken body. He felt the needles in his spine. He felt the cold gel against his skin. He felt the 112 burn marks screaming for attention. But beneath the pain, he felt the heartbeat of the station, and more importantly, he felt the steady, stubborn pulse of the woman sitting 3 meters away from his bed. The glass cathedral began to shatter. The golden ghost dissolved into static. Kaelen Voss fought his way back through the layers of data and darkness, pushing past the comfort of death until he broke the surface of consciousness. He opened his eyes. The light was too bright. The air was too cold. But as his vision cleared, he saw her, Archon Valerius, her head bowed, her hand resting on the edge of his cradle. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. Instead, he simply moved his fingers. He felt them brush against hers. Valerius looked up, her eyes wide, her mask of iron finally cracking to reveal the raw, human relief underneath. Kaelen, she whispered. Ma'am, he wheezed the word of victory. You're still in the wrong chair. She didn't correct him. She didn't issue an order. She simply reached out and gripped his hand. And for the first time in his life, Kaelen Voss didn't feel like a tool. He felt like a choice. The cost of a choice is rarely paid in a single installment. For Archon Valerius, the price was being extracted in the quiet, deadly corridors of the High Council chamber, 6 levels above the infirmary where her heart remained anchored. It had been 48 hours since Kaelen Voss had flickered back to life, and in that time, the political atmosphere of Xylos Station had turned from support to a chilling, predatory opportunism. Valerius stood before the long, obsidian table of the council. Behind her stood 2 palace guards, their faces hidden behind expressionless gold visors. Across from her sat the 5 high ministers, the brass, who managed the gears of the station. At the center was Minister Vane, a man whose family had controlled the station's oxygen refineries for 3 generations. He was a man of cold numbers and long memories. "Your Majesty," Vane said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "we are heartened to hear that Commander Voss has regained consciousness. Truly, it is a miracle of modern medicine, or perhaps a miracle of royal expenditure." Valerius kept her posture rigid. Her long, unadorned ears flicked slightly, a sign of irritation she couldn't quite suppress. "The resources allocated to the commander's recovery were within my discretionary authority, Minister. Unless the refinery yields have dropped, I fail to see why this is a council matter." "It becomes a council matter when the Archon of Xylos spends 2 days and 2 nights in a medical ward while the outer provinces are in open revolt," Vane countered. He tapped a glass-topped tablet, and a series of holographic maps bloomed in the center of the table. "House Valer's remnants have seized the mining outposts on Velonis Prime. They are claiming that the central government is distracted, that the Archon has abandoned her duty to the state to play nursemaid to a remnant. A remnant who saved the heir to this throne," Valerius reminded them. "A tool that functioned as intended," another minister chimed in. "If my thermal generator saves my house from freezing, I do not sit by its side while the repair drones work. I check the output and move on." The comparison made Valerius's blood run cold. This was the trap. By humanizing Kaelen, she had made herself appear vulnerable in their eyes. In the harsh meritocracy of Xylos, empathy was often mistaken for a glitch in the system. "He is more than a generator, Minister," she said. "He carries the memory core. If he had died before the integration was complete, the Aegis would have locked us out for 100 years. I stayed to ensure the transition." "And yet," Vane said, leaning forward, "you chose to use the royal biocircuit. You have linked your own biosignature to a man who is, by law, a state-owned asset. If he suffers a neural spike, you suffer. If he dies, the throne becomes unstable. You have given a bodyguard the power to kill the Archon simply by failing to survive. That is not just sentiment, Valerius. That is treason against the stability of the station." The silence in the room was heavy enough to choke on. The palace guards behind her shifted their weight, their armor clanking softly. "What are you proposing, Vane?" Valerius asked. "A temporary transfer of executive authority," Vane said, his eyes gleaming with the light of the holograms. "Until Commander Voss is fully decommissioned and the memory core is safely extracted into a stable, non-biological storage unit. You are clearly too compromised to make objective tactical decisions regarding House Valer." "Decommissioned?" Valerius felt a surge of fury that threatened to break her composure. He just woke up. His mind is still integrating the biocircuit. To extract the core now would be a death sentence. "A regrettable necessity for the safety of 10 million citizens," Vane replied smoothly. "General Cross has already prepared the extraction team. They are waiting for your authorization, or if you refuse, the council's majority vote." Valerius looked at the 5 faces across from her. She saw no mercy. She saw men who had spent their lives calculating the cost of oxygen and the value of steel. To them, Kaelen wasn't a man. He was a security risk, and she was a leader who had forgotten her place in the machine. "I will not sign it," she said. "Then we will put it to a vote," Vane said. "And I suspect the results will be efficient." Valerius turned on her heel and marched out of the chamber before the vote could be called. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the bustling aides in the hallways. She headed straight for the private lift that led back to the infirmary. When she stepped into the medical ward, the quiet was a physical relief. The hum of the soma weavers had slowed to a gentle purr. Kaelen was no longer submerged. The cradle had been drained, and he lay on a bed of soft, kinetic silk. He was pale, his chest wrapped in bandages that were already being stained by the weeping wounds of the restoration process. Lysandra was there, curled up in a chair, asleep with a tech manual over her face. Valerius approached the bed. Kaelen's eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "You look like you just went 10 rounds with a hull crusher," Kaelen murmured without looking at her. "The council is a different kind of combat, Kaelen," she said, sitting in her usual chair. She felt 100 years old. "They want the core. They want to decommission you." Kaelen finally turned his head. The violet glow at the base of his neck pulsed once, a low, steady light. "I heard the transmission, The infirmary's comms array isn't as secure as they think, especially not for someone with a royal override in his skull. Then you know the risk. I've been a state-owned asset since I was 20, Kaelen said, his voice flat. I know how the math works. Vane is a glitchhead, but his logic is sound. I'm a liability. Valerius reached out, her hand hovering over his. You are not a liability to me. Archon, Kaelen said, and for the first time, he used her title with a weight that felt like an ending. If the Valor fleet hits the mining outposts, and the Aegis isn't reset because you're busy protecting me, that's on your head. You can't save one person and lose a world. That's the first thing you taught me. I was wrong, she whispered. Kaelen blinked. Beg pardon? I thought that leadership was about the grand scale, about the 10 million. But if I can't protect the one man who gave everything to save my family, then what exactly am I defending? A collection of refineries? A pile of obsidian? If Xylos has no room for loyalty, then it's already dead, Kaelen. We're just presiding over the funeral. Kaelen watched her. He saw the exhaustion, the fear, and the fierce flickering hope in her eyes. He thought about the ghosts in the machine, the silver figures who had told him that he was just a circuit. They're coming, aren't they? He asked. The extraction team. Vane is calling the vote now. Cross will be here within the hour. Kaelen looked at his hands. They were steady now. The royal bio circuit was doing more than just healing him. It was rewriting him. He could feel the station systems humming in the distance. The power grids, the oxygen scrubbers, the weapon turrets. He wasn't just a remnant anymore. He was the Aegis. Let them come, Kaelen said, a cold, dangerous light entering his eyes. Kaelen, you can't fight them. You can barely sit up. I don't need to fight them with a blade, ma'am, he said. He reached out and gripped her hand, his fingers surprisingly strong. You gave me a choice when you put that circuit in my head. You gave me the keys to the house, and I think it's time we showed Minister Vane that the locks have changed. Adam, what are you going to do? I'm going to do my job, he said. I'm going to protect the Archon, but this time, I'm doing it as a volunteer. In the distance, the heavy doors of the medical ward chimed. The sound of armored boots, General Cross's men, echoed in the hallway. Lysandra woke up with a start, the manual sliding off her face. Valerius stood up, her jaw set, her long ears held high. She didn't have her obsidian rings, but as she stood beside Kaelen's bed, she had never looked more like a ruler. 1 hour, she whispered to Kaelen. Plenty of time, he replied. I've done more with less. The turning point had arrived. The cost was set. And as the doors to the infirmary began to open, the girl, the soldier, and the queen stood together in the quiet light, waiting for the storm to break. The heavy obsidian doors of the royal infirmary did not open. They were overridden. A sharp mechanical chime echoed through the sterile air, followed by the hiss of hydraulic seals being forced apart by a master key. General Cross marched in first, his power armor humming with an aggressive, low-frequency vibration that rattled the glass vials on the nearby medical carts. Behind him followed a squad of 4 extraction specialists, men in sleek, matte black hazard suits carrying specialized neural decoupling rigs. Minister Vane brought up the rear, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at the data scrolls hovering above the bed. General Cross, Archon Valerius said, her voice rising like a blade of ice to meet the intrusion. She stood at the foot of Kaelen's bed, her posture so rigid it seemed she might shatter before she bent. You are trespassing in a restricted medical zone. Withdraw your men immediately. With all due respect, Your Majesty, Cross said, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speakers. The Council has reached a majority verdict. Under Article 9 of the Continuity Act, the security of the memory core supersedes individual medical stay during a Level 1 insurrection. We are here to secure the keys. He just woke up, Cross, Lysandra shouted, jumping to her feet. She looked small against the towering soldiers, but her eyes burned with a fire that made the lead extraction tech hesitate. You'll kill him. You know the integration isn't finished. The boy is a remnant, Princess, Vane said, stepping around the general. He spoke with the patient condescension of a man explaining the weather to a child. He is a vessel, a highly sophisticated, remarkably durable vessel, but a vessel nonetheless. We do not mourn the fuel tank when we must save the ship. Kaelen Voss watched them from the bed. He didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a man made of bandages and pale translucent skin. But beneath the sheets, his right hand was slowly closing into a fist. The violet light at the base of his skull wasn't just pulsing anymore. It was beginning to throb in time with the station's core. "Vane," Kaelen croaked. The room went silent. The extraction team stopped their advance. Kaelen's voice was thin, but it carried a strange resonant echo, as if he were speaking through a long metal pipe. "You always were a total suit-and-tie shark. No heart, just a ledger where your soul should be," Vane sneered. "The fact that you can still breathe, Commander, is a testament to the Archon's poor judgment. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. If you cooperate, we can attempt a localized extraction. You might even keep enough of your motor functions to operate a desk." "And if I don't?" Kaelen asked. "Then we take the core by force," Cross said, his gauntlets whining as he prepped a localized EMP burst, a tool used to stun remnants who had gone rogue. "Stow the chatter, Voss. You're done. You've been a good shield, but the wall is coming down." Valerius stepped directly into Cross's path. "If you fire that burst, you hit me as well, General. The biocircuit has linked our biosignatures. My heart is currently slave to his neural rhythm. If you frag his brain, you frag mine." Cross froze. He looked at Vane, his confidence wavering for the first time. "Minister, the data didn't mention a bidirectional link." "She's bluffing," Vane snapped, though he stepped back a half-meter. "The Archon would never be so reckless as to tie her life force to a common soldier." "Try me," Valerius challenged. She reached back and took Kaelen's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. In that moment, Kaelen didn't see the infirmary anymore. He saw the station. Through the royal biocircuit, Valerius's touch acted as a ground, a stabilizer that allowed him to push his consciousness past the limits of his own damaged brain. He felt the cold, hard logic of the station's mainframe. He felt the 354 defense turrets on the outer hull. He felt the oxygen levels in the lower slums and the frantic heartbeats of the millions of citizens who were terrified of the coming storm. "They're here," Kaelen whispered. "Who?" Lysandra asked, her voice trembling. "The Valor fleet," Kaelen said. His eyes rolled back, glowing with a pure, blinding violet light. 3 heavy cruisers, 12 interceptor wings. They just exited the nebula's shadow. T-minus 5 minutes to weapons range. Cross checked his wrist display. "Liar. Our long-range sensors are dark." "Your sensors are being jammed by an internal override," Kaelen said, his voice now a perfect, terrifying harmony of his own and the station's synthetic AI. "Sector 9, maintenance subdeck. Your loyal tech priests are gearheads for House Valor, General. They've blinded you." A siren began to wail deep within the station's bowels, a low, mournful groan that signaled a breach in the outer perimeter. "Hostile signatures detected," a voice barked over Cross's comlink. "General, we've got incoming. High-yield ion signatures. They're bypassing the outer shield grid. How the hell did they get the codes?" Vane's face went white. "Impossible. The codes are in the core." "The codes were leaked weeks ago, Vane," Kaelen said, his body arching off the bed as the station's data poured through him. "House Valor didn't want the core to get the codes. They wanted the core so they could shut the Aegis down from the inside. And you were going to hand it to them on a silver platter." "General, secure the Archon!" Vane screamed, panic finally shattering his mask. "Extract the core now. We have to reset the grid manually." "Touch him and we all die," Valerius warned. She looked at Kaelen, her face a mask of pure, focused will. "Kaelen, can you hold them?" "The Aegis is fragged, ma'am," Kaelen wheezed, his teeth gritted against the surge of information. "The internal buffers are overloaded. If I try to force a reset, the feedback will melt my brain. I'm just one man." "You are not just a man," Valerius said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "You are the choice I made. You are the devotion I chose to answer. Reach into the gold, Kaelen. Use my strength. Use the bloodline." Kaelen didn't think. He didn't calculate. He reached. He dived back into the cathedral of light he had seen in his coma. But this time, he wasn't a ghost. He was a commander. He saw the silver figures of the past remnants, the thousands of souls who had been turned into data. "Help me," he commanded. "We are the wall," the chorus replied, their voices no longer cold, but resonant with a sudden, shared purpose. "We do not act for ourselves. We act for the one who stays." In the infirmary, Kaelen's body erupted in a halo of violet and gold energy. The extraction specialists were thrown back by a kinetic wave that cracked the medical monitors. Cross raised his arm to shield his eyes as the air in the room began to hum with the power of 1,000 suns. Kaelen Voss wasn't just a bodyguard anymore. He was the station. He reached out across the void and felt the Valor cruisers. He felt their predatory intent, their fingers on the triggers of their ion cannons. He didn't fight them with logic. He fought them with the raw, stubborn defiance of a man who had taken 100 hits and refused to fall. He seized the Aegis's power grid and rerouted it. He bypassed the jammed sensors, burned through the traitorous overrides in Sector 9, and slammed the shields back into place with the force of a falling moon. On the external view screens, the violet shield of Xylo's station flickered, then roared into life, turning the incoming ion bolts into harmless sprays of light. Kaelen slumped back onto the pillows, the light fading from his eyes. His breathing was a ragged, terrifying sound. The royal biocircuit at the base of his neck was smoking, the smell of burnt insulation filling the room. Valerius didn't let go of his hand. She looked at Cross and Vane, her eyes cold and triumphant. "The shields are holding," she said, "and the commander is still breathing. General, take Minister Vane into custody. Charge him with high treason and reckless endangerment of the state." Cross looked at Kaelen, then at the Archon. He saw the link between them, the violet thread of energy that was still pulsing between their joined hands. He saw a queen who had risked everything for a soldier, and a soldier who had become a god to save his queen. He snapped a crisp military salute. "Yes, Your Majesty," Cross said. He turned to his men. "Secure the minister and get some real medics in here. Our commander has some more recovering to do." As they dragged a screaming Vane out of the room, Lysandra threw herself onto the bed, sobbing into Kaelen's shoulder. "You big, stupid gearhead," she choked out. "I thought you were going to flatline for real this time." Kaelen managed a weak, trembling hand and rested it on her head. "I told you, I'm surprisingly persuasive." He looked at Valerius. She was still sitting there, her face pale, her strength nearly spent. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. In the quiet of the room, amidst the ruins of the medical equipment and the smell of ozone, they both knew that the math of Xylos had changed forever. They weren't parts in a machine. They were a family. And for the first time in 23 years, the Archon of Xylos allowed herself to cry. The victory was not a resolution. It was a reprieve. While the immediate threat of the Valor fleet had been blunted by the sudden reactivation of the shields, the station was still a wounded beast. Beneath the polished obsidian floors of the Citadel, fires were raging in the maintenance subdecks. The purge of the traitorous tech priests had left the engineering department in shambles, and the Aegis, now permanently fused with Kaelen's neural architecture, was fluctuating wildly. Kaelen Voss had not kipped out in 36 hours. He couldn't. He was sitting upright in a specialized command throne they had brought into the infirmary. He was no longer covered in bandages. Instead, he was draped in a feedback suit that looked like a web of glowing fibers. His eyes were closed, but his mind was 5 kilometers away, deep in the station's thermal regulation systems. "You're pushing too hard, Voss," a voice said. Kaelen didn't open his eyes. "The pressure in Sector 4 is spiking, General. If I don't vent the coolant, we lose the whole residential wing. I'm fine." General Cross stood by the window, watching the distant flashes of light as the station's point defense turrets picked off the remaining Valor boarding craft. The general had changed. He no longer looked at Kaelen as a piece of hardware. He looked at him with a mixture of awe and something that resembled fear. "You're managing 3,000 separate data streams," Cross said. "Most remnants would have suffered a total neural meltdown by the 10th hour. How are you still holding it together?" "I'm not holding it," Kaelen said, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "The ghosts are helping." Cross frowned. "The ghosts?" "The archives. The ones who came before. They're not just data, Cross. They're memories. They're tired of being ignored. They like that someone is finally listening to them." Kaelen opened his eyes. They were no longer the deep brown they had been. They were a swirling storm of violet and gold, the iris fractured by 1,000 tiny lines of light. "We've got a problem," Kaelen said, his posture straightening. "The Valor flagship, the Obsidian Tear, it's not retreating, it's accelerating. They're aiming for the pulsar junction. If they hit the junction, the atmospheric shields collapse," Cross said, his hand flying to his comms link. "We won't just burn, the whole station will lose structural integrity." "They know I can't leave the throne," Kaelen said. "They're betting I can't move the station's mass fast enough to dodge a suicide run." "Can you?" Kaelen checked the power coupling. "No, not without burning out every circuit in my head. I'd save the station, but I'd be a meat sack by the time we stop moving." The door opened, and Archon Valerius entered. She looked refreshed, though the rings were still missing from her ears. She walked straight to Kaelen and placed a hand on his shoulder. The moment she touched him, the violet storm in his eyes calmed. "We have a plan," she said. "I hope it involves a very large hammer," Kaelen muttered. "It involves the choice," she replied. She looked at Cross. "General, prepare the long-range teleporters. I'm going to the Obsidian Tear." "Absolutely not!" Cross and Kaelen shouted in unison. "Your Majesty, that's a suicide mission," Cross said. "They'll tear you apart the moment you materialize." "They won't," Valerius said, her voice full of a quiet, terrifying certainty. "Because they believe I'm still the ruler who values the crown above all else. They think I'm coming to negotiate. They don't realize I'm coming to end them." She looked at Kaelen. "I need you to open a micro wormhole through the shield grid, just for 2 seconds, long enough for me and a strike team to bypass their hull." "Ma'am, if I mess up the timing, you'll be fused into the bulkhead," Kaelen said, his voice trembling. "I can't risk you, not after everything." "You aren't risking me, Kaelen," she said, leaning down so her face was inches from his. "I am choosing this, just like you chose to stand in that gallery, just like you chose to come back from the void. You gave me my daughter's life. You gave me my world. Now, let me do my job." Kaelen looked at her. He felt her heartbeat through the biocircuit. It was steady, brave, and full of a fierce love for the people she ruled. He realized then that the lesson he had been learning wasn't just about his own value. It was about the fact that true leadership wasn't about command. It was about being worthy of the loyalty you were given. 2 seconds, Kaelen said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you're not back in 5 minutes, I'm coming in after you, and I'm bringing the whole station with me." Valerius smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'd expect nothing less from the most insubordinate bodyguard in the nebula." The next 10 minutes were a blur of high-stakes tension. Kaelen focused every ounce of his will on the station's teleportation matrix. He had to thread a needle through a hurricane. He felt the Obsidian Tear's shields humming, a hostile red barrier that wanted to keep him out. "Teleporters locked," Cross announced. "Strike team ready. Your Majesty, on your mark." Valerius stepped into the teleportation cradle. She was wearing a sleek suit of black combat armor, a pulse rifle slung over her shoulder. She looked like a goddess of war, born from the very obsidian that formed her home. "Now, Kaelen," she whispered. Kaelen roared, his mind flaring with a white-hot intensity. He seized the station's power and focused it into a singular, microscopic point. He felt the resistance, the screaming feedback of the Aegis as he forced it to do the impossible. He tore a hole in reality. The light in the infirmary blinded everyone for a heartbeat. When it faded, the cradle was empty. Kaelen slumped in his throne, blood trickling from his nose. "They're in," he gasped. "Gods, they're in!" He watched the battle through the sensors. He saw the flashes of pulse fire inside the enemy flagship. He felt the vibration of the explosions as Valerius and her team fought their way to the bridge. He saw the Obsidian Tear begin to veer off course, its engines sputtering as the command codes were overwritten from the inside. 3 minutes passed. 4. Come on, Kaelen hissed, his fingers digging into the armrests of the throne. At 4 minutes and 55 seconds, his internal comms link crackled to life. "Voss? You there, you big lug?" It was Lysandra's voice. She had snuck onto the strike team. "Lysandra, where is the Archon?" "She's fine. She's currently explaining the concept of unconditional surrender to the Valor admirals with the butt of her rifle. We've secured the bridge. The flagship is ours. Kaelen let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, the violet light in his iris fading back to a gentle, steady brown. The battle was over. The coup was crushed. Xylos was safe. But as the adrenaline faded, Kaelen felt a new sensation. It wasn't pain. It wasn't static. It was a sense of profound, quiet transformation. He looked at his hands, which were still glowing faintly with the gold of the royal biocircuit. He realized he would never be just a man again. He was something new, something that bridged the gap between the machine and the soul. He had walked into the fire as a tool, and he had emerged as a brother, a father, and a protector. You did it, Cross said, placing a hand on Kaelen's arm. You actually did it, Voss. Nyasat. No, Kaelen said, looking toward the window where the first light of the pulsar was beginning to peek over the horizon of the station. We did it, and for the first time, I think I know what we were actually defending. What's that? Kaelen smiled, a tired, crooked, but infinitely human smile. The windows, he said, the parts that let the light in. The transformation was painful, yes. The scars on his body would never fully heal, and his mind would always carry the whispers of the thousands of remnants who lived within the Aegis. But as he sat there, watching the sun rise over the station he had died to save, Kaelen Voss realized that he wasn't a prisoner of his duty anymore. He was home, and for a man who had been built to be a wall, that was the greatest victory of all. The silence that followed the surrender of the obsidian tier was louder than the battle itself. On Xylos Station, the rhythmic thrum of the pulsar junction settled into a low, steady hum that vibrated through the deck plates, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to sigh in relief. In the Royal Infirmary, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt copper, and the cooling fluid of the command throne. Kaelen Voss did not move. He couldn't. His mind was still tethered to the Aegis by 10,000 invisible threads of data. He could feel the cooling systems in the residential sectors finally stabilizing. He could feel the atmospheric scrubbers chugging as they filtered the smoke from the lower deck fires. He could feel the weight of the thousands of souls within the station's memory banks. The ghosts of the past remnants, slowly receding back into the golden architecture of the Synapse Bridge. Voss? Kaelen, talk to me. General Cross's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of an ocean. Kaelen forced his eyes open. The violet storm in his irises was flickering, replaced by the dull, exhausted brown of his natural eyes. He looked at Cross, who was leaning over him, his power armor scarred and pitted from the localized kinetic surges. Situation? Status? Kaelen wheezed. His voice was a wreck, a dry rasp that hurt his throat. Situation normal, Cross replied, and for the first time in 10 years, the general didn't sound like a tactical manual. He sounded human. The strike team has neutralized the flagship's bridge. The remaining Valor vessels have powered down their lances. It's a total cluster frag for the extremists, Kaelen. They're folding like cheap alloy. The Archon? She's on her way back. Transport shuttle is docked. She's walking, if that's what you're asking, though she's probably going to need a new suit of armor and a very long nap. Kaelen closed his eyes again, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Copy that. Good. That's solid. The medical drones descended then, their mechanical limbs moving with a frantic precision. They began the agonizing process of decoupling the feedback suit from Kaelen's neural ports. Each fiber that was pulled free felt like a hot needle being dragged through his nerves. He didn't scream. He just gripped the armrests of the throne until the reinforced carbon fiber began to crack. Steady, Commander, the chief medic said, his voice no longer clinical, but filled with a profound, quiet respect. You've integrated more data in 5 hours than most remnants do in a lifetime. Your neural pathways are a mess, but the biocircuit held. It actually held. I had help, Kaelen muttered, his head lolling to the side as the last of the connectors snapped free. He felt the weight of the station leave him. For a moment, the sudden silence in his head was terrifying. For days, he had been the wind, the steel, and the fire of Xylos. Now he was just a man again. A broken, scarred, 32-year-old man with 112 burn marks and a heart that felt 3 sizes too big for his chest. The infirmary doors hissed open. Archon Valerius entered, followed closely by Lysandra. The Archon was a sight to behold. Her armor was scorched black, her face was smeared with carbon dust, and she was limping slightly. But she carried herself with a clarity that no crown could provide. Lysandra didn't wait for protocol. She sprinted across the room, dodging a medrone, and threw her arms around Kaelen's neck. "You big, stubborn glitch!" she cried, her voice muffled by his feedback suit. "You actually did it! You moved the whole station! Do you have any idea how much paperwork you just created for the navigation department?" Kaelen managed a weak, trembling laugh, his hand rising to pat her back. I'll file a formal apology later, Highness. Right now, I think I'm going to bug out for a bit." Valerius stepped up to the throne. She looked at Kaelen, and for a long moment, no words were spoken. She didn't thank him. She didn't cite his bravery. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat that the Royal Biocircuit had fought so hard to preserve. "The Council is being dissolved, Kaelen," she said quietly. "Vane and the others, they are being stripped of their titles. We are restructuring. No more state-owned assets. No more vessels for the Memory Corps." Kaelen blinked, trying to process the words. "But the Aegis, it needs a host. It needs a remnant. It needs a protector," Valerius corrected. "But from now on, that protector will be a citizen, a volunteer, not a tool we wire into the hull against their will. You've shown us that the station's strength doesn't come from the iron in our walls, but from the blood in our veins." General Cross stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I've already had the engineers look at the maintenance logs. We're decommissioning the old Synapse Bridge protocols. We're going to build a new interface, one that doesn't require neural slavery. It'll take years, but we're starting today." Kaelen looked from the general to the Archon, then to the girl still clinging to his shoulder. He felt a strange, fluttering sensation in his chest. Not a neural spike, but a hope that felt as vast as the nebula outside. "What happens to me?" he asked. Valerius smiled, and this time, there was no shadow of the ruler in it. Just a woman who had seen the end of the world and decided to rebuild it. "You're going to recover," she said, "and then you're going to help Lysandra with those windows she keeps talking about. I think Xylos could use a few more views of the stars." As the medics moved Kaelen back to the recovery bed, he looked out the small, reinforced observation port of the infirmary. He saw the obsidian tear being towed into the salvage docks. He saw the thousands of lights of the residential sectors, glowing like a field of fallen stars, and he realized that he wasn't just a shield anymore. He was part of the light. The war was over. The choice had been made, and as Kaelen Voss finally allowed himself to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, he knew that the iron of Xylos would never feel cold again. 3 months had passed since the pulsar junction had nearly been torn apart, and Xylos Station looked like a different world. The scorched marble of the Crystal Gallery had been replaced, but instead of the opaque, defensive obsidian of the past, the floor was now made of reinforced, translucent polyglass. For the first time in the station's history, the citizens could look down into the glowing heart of their home and see the machinery of their survival, not as a hidden secret, but as a shared responsibility. Kaelen Voss walked through the gallery without the aid of a medrone. He still carried a cane made of lightweight aerosteel, and his gait was slower, more deliberate than the predatory stride of his youth. The scars on his face and arms were permanent, silver pale lines that mapped the 112 hits he had taken to save a princess. But he didn't hide them. He wore them like a history book. "You're late," Lysandra called out. She was standing on the new observation deck, which had been built into the very terrace where the first ambush had occurred. She was wearing a technician's jumpsuit, her hands covered in grease, looking far more like an engineer than a royal heir. Behind her, a massive 3-meter-wide window of clear diamond glass looked out over the spinning violet majesty of the nebula. "I'm not late," Kaelen replied, leaning on his cane as he reached her side. "I was merely conserving energy for the walk. You know how it is for us old gearheads." Lysandra laughed, wiping a smudge of oil from her forehead. "Old? You're 32, Kaelen. That's barely ancient in station years. Besides, you've got a royal biocircuit in your head. You're practically a god." A god who still needs synth coffee to function in the morning, he muttered, though he couldn't hide the twinkle in his eyes. They stood together looking out at the stars. The station was buzzing with a new kind of energy. The council had been replaced by a representative assembly, and the remnant program had been officially retired. Kaelen was now the chief instructor for the new volunteer guard, a group of men and women who chose to protect the station because they loved it, not because they were programmed to. Archon Valerius joined them, her steps silent on the glass floor. She was wearing a simple, elegant robe of deep violet, and the iron rings had returned to her ears. But they were different now. They weren't engraved with the sigils of ancient authority, but with the names of the sectors of the station. The first shuttle to the surface of Velonis Prime departs at 6 in the morning, Valerius said, standing on Kaelen's other side. They're building the first atmospheric dome on a real planet. No steel ceilings, no recycled air, just sky. Kaelen looked at her. You should go, ma'am. You've earned a few days of real gravity. I'm considering it, she said, her gaze drifting to the horizon. But I think I prefer the view from here for a while longer. It's a lot easier to see the future when you aren't constantly looking for the next attack. She turned to Kaelen, her expression turning serious. The biocircuit, is it still quiet? Like a sleeping cat, Kaelen said, touching the base of his neck. The ghosts in the machine, they're still there, but they aren't screaming anymore. They're just memories. They're part of the station, and I'm part of them. It's not a burden anymore. It's a connection. Valerius nodded, a deep, abiding sense of peace settling over her features. She had risked everything, her throne, her life, the stability of her world, to save a single man. And in doing so, she had saved the soul of her civilization. Kaelen stepped closer to the window, his hand resting on the cool diamond glass. He looked at the reflection of the three of them, the queen, the heir, and the soldier, standing together against the vast, dark expanse of the universe. He thought about the day he had stood in the fire. He thought about the 112 times he had been hit, and the 1,000 times before that when he had believed himself to be nothing more than a tool in a box. He realized then that the most powerful technology on Xylos wasn't the Aegis, or the biocircuit, or the pulsar junction. It was the simple, terrifying, beautiful ability to look at another person and say, "You are worth the cost." He had lived his life as a wall, but in the end, it was the windows that had saved him. I remember the weight of the first ion lance hitting my chest. It wasn't the heat that stayed with me, but the sudden, sharp clarity of what I was losing. For 12 years, I had walked these halls as a phantom, a piece of hardware with a name I barely recognized. I thought that loyalty was a contract, a series of zeros and ones etched into my synapse bridge by a government that saw me as a depreciating asset. I thought that being a hero meant being a machine that didn't know how to break. But as I stand here now, feeling the sun through a window I once called a vulnerability, I realize how wrong I was. The 112 wounds didn't make me a hero. The choice to stay, even when the programming told me to run, was the only thing that actually mattered. I spent my life looking for a reason to fight, only to find that the reason wasn't a mission or a country. It was the warmth of a hand on mine in a dark room. It was a queen who didn't leave her guard's side when the world told her he was trash. We are all just variables in a cold universe, bouncing off one another in the dark. But when we choose to hold on, really hold on, we create something that no pulsar can ever burn away. I'm not a wall anymore. I'm a man who chose to be home. And for the first time, the silence in my head isn't empty. It's full of 1,000 lives that finally know what it means to be free. I spent my whole life being told that my purpose was defined by the gear in my spine and the orders in my ears. But in the end, it was a single choice that defined who I really am. It makes me wonder about the walls we all build around ourselves, the protocols we follow because we're afraid of being vulnerable. Tell me, if you were stripped of your titles, your job, and the expectations of everyone around you, who would you choose to stand for when the fire starts? What is the one thing in your life that is worth taking 100 hits for? Kaelen Voss turned away from the window and followed the Archon and the princess back into the heart of the station. He didn't look back at the stars. He looked at the two people walking ahead of him, and for the first time in his life, He didn't check the thermal signatures in the vents. He simply walked, his cane tapping a steady human rhythm on the glass floor as the sun of a new Xylos began to rise.